I'm Tony Preckwinkle, Chair of the Cook County Democratic Party, and I'd like to welcome you to the 80, our podcast about the party, its candidates, and its leaders. We're beginning the podcast by interviewing our own elected Democratic committee people to discuss their backgrounds and thoughts about the history and future of our party. Today, I'm excited to welcome Lucy Moog, committee person of the 43rd Ward in Chicago. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Now, why don't we begin, as we often do in these conversations, with how you got in politics?
So I grew up in Chicago. I grew up in what's now the 44th Ward, but in Lakeview. And one of the first campaigns I remember working on, I think I was 16 for Paul Simon's race, which I believe was in 1984 when he was running for the Senate. And a friend asked if I wanted to go flyer cars around the neighborhood, which is not something people do anymore, but that's what we did. And I thought it was really fun, but I didn't really think much about it. And then when I went to college, I was a psychology and sociology major, and I took a class of women in government, and it sort of changed the whole trajectory for me. And I ended up spending a semester in Washington, where I worked for a pro-choice lobbying organization that was lobbying for Title X money, and it all changed. Like once I went to DC, I was just enamored with the place and sort of had the Potomac fever, and then went there after college and worked on Capitol Hill, and it just became who I was. And then I came back to Chicago because I have older siblings who were starting a family, and I wanted to be kind of around and more a part of it. And my parents were here, and I had a grandmother here who was totally awesome. And I just stayed with it. I've had one job in the private sector. I worked for a PR type consulting firm, which actually had a number of political people who worked there. But every other job has been in politics. I worked on the Clinton campaign in 92 and 96. I did some work for Obama. I worked on a very big art installation along the lakefront that was called Cool Globes, those huge globes. And that even kind of had a political sort of tint to it, where it was educating people about what they could do and putting pressure on leaders about global warming. So it's always been kind of who I am.
All right. So you started in campaigns when you were 16, which is the same thing for me, by the way. My first campaign was when I was 16 years old. And actually, I'm a little older than you. Pardon me?
Whose was that?
Katie McWatt, the first African-American woman to run for city council in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I grew up.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That's cool.
And I worked actually for Paul Simon, but in his lieutenant governor's race when I was in college. And as many may know, he was lieutenant governor before he ran for Senate. Lieutenant governor with Ogilvie, I think. So when you could run separately for lieutenant governor. Yeah. So you've been involved in politics for a long time here in the city. What do you want to see our Cook County Democratic Party tackle in terms of issues or challenges?
Well, I would say it's obviously to engage people further. I would love to see more women of color elected, and more young people. So definitely building a bench. I feel like we need it in my community and in many others. We've seen a lot of these appointments and people move on, and we want to have a really robust bench to choose from. People who have been trained on how to run campaigns, how to work on campaigns, and how to get it done. So those would be my big goals. But obviously women, we need more women everywhere. We've made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of ceilings we have to break.
Quite true. And, one of the things the party did in the last couple of years, which we hadn't done before, is kind of training sessions for people who are interested in campaigns, the finance part, the field work, all of it, so that more folks have a sense of what it's like. Although clearly the best way to learn about a campaign is to actually work in one.
Yes, and that is what I do tell people. But there are times, and obviously probably not in Cook County, but when we're looking at the future of the Democratic Party of Illinois, for instance, in other counties that are much more conservative, if there isn't a Democrat on the ballot and they are going to somebody in the community and encouraging them to run, and when you go talk to women, you often have to ask them a couple times before they say yes.
Right.
It would be awesome if there was some sort of an apparatus set up, like this is the language for a petition. This is how we get petitions. This is how you could have a website, just all of the things that we know, and that our committee people have been really good at doing, but in some counties across the state, maybe not necessarily. So just sort of giving people the tools to help them get up and get on the ballot and run, because it might be somebody who's been on a school board who knows a lot about education policy, but they might not know a lot about a campaign, who could be the best candidate. So just helping them, have the tools that they need to get going.
Right. I know that the Democratic Party in the state is strongest in half a dozen or less counties. And the big challenge we have, as you point out, is that out of our 102 counties, that's not a lot. Fortunately, it's the biggest one, including Cook. But trying to build the bench across the state is surely a challenge going forward for the party. And we're in the midst of a contest now for leadership in the party, and we don't know how that turns out. But I hope that whoever is successful shares that commitment to party building all across the state. So that's good.
Yeah, and I think given the people who've said that they want to run, I do believe that is there. And I think there's really nowhere to go except up as far as it being inclusive and a lot of information for people. And, Illinois used to be a purple state. It is not anymore, which is awesome, but we do have work to do, because when you look at the Trump map of 16 and when you look at it of 20, it's a little scary.
Right. Exactly.
The rest of the state.
Right.
So we do need to do a lot of work. And I actually think that Cook County can be a big piece of it in helping other people.
We hope and pray. When you look at the national scene, what do you hope to see from the Biden administration or our organizing nationally around 2022?
Well, I think he is like the absolute perfect leader for this time. He and Senator Harris, or Vice President Harris, they are the best. There is so much compassion and smarts, and they've obviously recruited incredible people. The pandemic is horrible, but I do feel like they are addressing it in a much different way than it feels so different this past month than it did, the previous administration. We obviously have a lot of work to do, because it's great that we have the Senate and the House for right now. Historically, it doesn't always look so good for midterm years. So I think we have to be really careful. But I think they have to really help people with jobs, and we have to get people back in school. And I mean, there's a lot to do, but I do feel like these are the best people who are poised to get it done. I feel really, the compassion and the heart and the warmth that comes out of DC is just palpable to me. As
we're speaking, earlier this week, President Biden and Vice President Harris participated in a memorial as we marked the point at which 500,000 Americans have succumbed to the coronavirus. And that's more than we've lost in World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam era combined, all in 1 year. And as you said, one of the things that I found most disturbing about President Trump is his refusal to acknowledge our losses, to acknowledge the good people across the country who succumbed to the disease. And as I said, I was really moved and heartened by President Biden's willing to acknowledge our losses and to lift up the people who've succumbed.
I so agree. Yeah.
What kind of political agenda do you hope the Biden administration pursues?
Well, minimum wage, obviously, that's a very hot one right now.
The fight for 15.
The fight for 15, even if it takes a while to get there, but just some sort of a plan to get us there in a few years. I would support that. I mean, is the federal minimum wage is 7 something right now? I mean, so that's a big difference.
7.25, I think. Yeah.
7.25. So acknowledging that is a very big difference, but a plan to get us there would be top priority. Obviously, investing in infrastructure is critical. We have a lot of those needs in Chicago and across the state. If we can address reproductive rights, just because we do have an issue looming with the Supreme Court, and you look at all of these individual states, and Luckily, Illinois is not one of them, but many states around us, it is definitely a risk. I guess those would be my top priorities. And then the schools, in whatever help the federal government can provide in helping to get our kids back to school and to get our teachers vaccinated, because I do realize that I do believe that that is a critical piece of it.
Well, I know that Democrats across the country have been pushing for raising the minimum wage for a long time. And it looks like we're at a moment in the midst of the pandemic where people might be more sympathetic to that than they have been in the past. As we know, essential workers who have kept our grocery stores and pharmacies and other places open, often are paid the very minimum wage, the very minimum national wage, let alone, which doesn't enable them to support their families,
Right, at all. Right. Yeah.
So that's a real challenge. Of course, as a county administrator, the investments in infrastructure are surely long overdue. Just as we had a 10-year hiatus in infrastructure, big infrastructure measures in the state of Illinois, and what happened in that 10-year interval. So that's a challenge. On reproductive rights, how are we going to get the federal government to take action given the recalcitrance of so many of our state leaders?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I don't know. That's a tough one.
Well,
there's the Hyde.
Go ahead.
No. I was going to say about the Hyde Amendment. Yeah.
Yes, a blessing from one of our own Illinois elected officials. For the benefit of those who may be too old to remember this, go ahead. Too young to remember this. Go ahead. Share it with us.
So the Hyde Amendment basically outlawed federal funding or taxpayer funding, right? So any municipality to fund an abortion. And it was, I don't know, Henry Hyde was a congressman from Illinois. And what year was that?
Right, I can't remember, but I don't think it prohibits taxpayer funding. I think it's just federal funding, because in Cook County in our health hospital system, we provide choice.
Right,
and reproductive health care to women.
That is a good correction, because also in Illinois with HB 40, Illinois is one of the only states where Medicaid can pay for an abortion in the whole state. So it was federal funding for taxpayer abortion.
Right. That's a real challenge. And on the public education side, as a teacher, of course, this is something close to my heart. And I'm grateful for the Biden administration's focus on getting our teachers and school staff vaccinated, because the people who are most in danger as we return young people to school are the adults, not the children, the adults. Right. So that's an important effort to try to be sure that our school personnel are vaccinated. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you wanted to share?
Well, one of your questions was about asking like other award organizations what they were doing, how they could help engage people.
Sure.
And when the pandemic first hit, I remember sending an email blast out that talked about, ways to engage in other primary states that were coming up for the presidential. People were like, okay, whatever. But I also talked about a bunch of needs in our community. So a couple shelters, things that they were looking for. So it was like PPE and food, shelf-stable food. And that really caught on with people. Some of our people who are our volunteers were just so thrilled to know that like Lakeview Pantry was sorting at Wrigley Field, or that Lincoln Park Community Shelter needed these items. And, it was like an Amazon wish list, but people could just click and send it to them. So throughout the pandemic, we have been doing a lot of that kind of work of connecting with these community organizations. And it just feels really good for everyone involved. On Martin Luther King Day, I had a chef who lives in the ward who is an awesome guy, and he taught a Zoom lesson of how to make lasagna online. We made over 200 lasagnas in Chicago and delivered them to different community so we delivered some to Thresholds, Lincoln Park Community Shelter, and a place in Garfield Park. Like, it was awesome. And it was sort of seamless. Like, people at their homes made one lasagna maybe for them and one to give away. And then we gave the directions, and then they just dropped it off at these places the next day. And it just felt so good.
Yeah.
And it was a nice thing. So just thinking sort of outside of the box of that's still engagement,
Right.
It's just different. and this is a quieter political time, right? Where we don't have election until next March or whenever they decide to do it, right?
Right.
So this is another way of engaging people and sort of broadening, bringing more volunteers in. And these are people who will probably trust you in the future when you're hosting a candidate forum. Hopefully we can do that kind of stuff again, and they'll come and meet your candidate and maybe end up voting for them. So,
Right. So although political activity is more circumscribed, there are other opportunities for civic engagement, and you've provided opportunities for people in the ward organization or that you've connected with to take advantage of those opportunities.
yeah, and it feels good. It's just nice. You're making new friends, even over Zoom, right? Who will.
Right. Right. Well,
So
committee person, we're very grateful that you joined us, and
thank you for having me.
appreciate your time. We look forward to continuing to partner as we try to build the Cook County Democratic Party.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.